This video is operations with complex numbers. We're going to start with multiplying. So example 1, we have 5i times 3 plus 4i. All we're going to do is distribute the 5i to the 3 and the 5i to the 4i. So 5i times 3 is 15i. Then 5i times 4i would be a positive 20i squared. Okay, what we need to remember is that I squared equals -1. So we need to replace the I squared with a -1. So we have 15i plus 20 times a -1. Well, 20 times a -1 is a -20. So I have 15i minus 20. And then I need to put it in the form of a plus bi. So I'm going to rearrange it and have -20 plus 15i. And that is my answer. Moving on to example 2. Notice now we have two binomials being multiplied. We have 4 plus 6i times 2 minus i. You can FOIL this, but I prefer the box method, so I start with drawing my box. I put my first binomial on the side, so 4 plus 6i. Then I put my second binomial on the top, 2 minus i. Then all I do is I fill in the boxes and multiply. So 4 times 2 gives me 8. 4 times a -i gives me a -4i. 6i times 2 gives me a 12i. 6i times a -i gives me a -6i squared. Remember that I squared equals -1, so I get a -6 times a -1. -6 times -1 gives me a +6. Now I need to combine like terms. So I'm looking, what can I combine with the 8? I can combine the 6. 8 plus 6 is 14. What can I combine with this 12i? A -4i. 12i minus 4i is a +8i. And it's in the form of a plus bi, so that's my answer. Moving on to example 3. I now have -3 plus I, and it's all being squared. So what we need to remember is we can rewrite this so we can see what it actually looks like as -3 plus I times -3 plus I. Okay, and then I start with my box. So I'm going to write the -3 plus I. And then on the other side, or on the top, I'm going to write -3 plus I. And then I just start filling in the squares. So -3 times -3 is a +9. -3 times I is a -3i. I times -3 is a -3i. I times I is an I squared. But remember, I squared equals -1. So now I can combine my like terms. So what can I combine with a 9? The -1. 9 minus 1 is 8. -3i minus 3i is a -6i. And that's my answer. It's in the form of a plus bi. Okay, we got one more example of multiplying. Notice now I have 4 minus 3i and 4 plus 3i. These are conjugates. So let's see what happens when we multiply conjugates. So again, I start with my box. I write my first one on the side, 4 minus 3i. I write my second binomial on the top, 4 plus 3i. And I just multiply it out. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 3i is 12i. -3i times 4 is a -12i. -3i times a +3i is a -9i squared. And again, I squared equals -1, so I have a -9 times a -1. -9 times a -1 is a +9. So then I can combine my like terms. So I can combine the 16 and the positive 9. 16 plus positive 9 is 25. Okay, when I try to combine the negative 12i and the positive 12i, they cancel out. So my answer is 25. Okay, now we are going to move on to dividing. So I have 8 divided by 3i. In order to divide complex numbers, we have to multiply by the conjugate of the denominator. So the conjugate of the denominator is a negative 3i. So I'm going to multiply the top by a negative 3i and the bottom by a negative 3i. Okay, so when I do that, I can just multiply. 8 times a negative 3i is a negative 24i. Okay, 3i times a negative 3i is a negative 9i squared. So now remember, I squared equals negative 1, so we need to simplify it. So I get equals negative 24i over negative 9 times negative 1. Well, negative 9 times negative 1 is positive 9, so I get negative 24i over a positive 9. And then we have to see if we can simplify the fraction. So what number goes into negative 24 and 9? Well, 3 goes into both of them. Okay, so I'm going to divide the top and the bottom by 3 to simplify the fraction. So negative 24i divided by 3 would be a negative 8i. 9 divided by 3 would be 3. And now my fraction is simplified as best it can be. So my answer is negative 8i divided by 3. Moving on to example 2. Now I have 10 divided by negative 5 minus I. So in order to divide, I have to multiply the top and the bottom by the conjugate of the bottom. So that means on the top, I'm going to multiply by negative 5 plus I. And on the bottom, I'm going to multiply by the same thing because whatever I do to the top, I have to do to the bottom. Okay, so I'm multiplying the top and the bottom by the conjugate of the denominator. So 10 times a negative 5 gives me a negative 50. 10 times I gives me a positive 10i. Now on the bottom, I have two binomials being multiplied, so this is where I need to do my box. I'm going to do that over here on the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to have a negative 5 minus I and a negative 5 plus I. Negative 5 times negative 5 is a positive 25. Negative 5 times I is a negative 5i. Negative I times a negative 5 is a positive 5i. And a negative I times a positive I is a negative I squared. Remember, I squared equals a negative 1. So now I have a negative 1. Two negatives make a positive, so that just equals a positive 1. So now I can combine my like terms. Okay, so my like terms, the 25 and the positive 1 give me 26. And then the negative 5i and the 5i cancel each other out. So I get 26 as my denominator. Now I need to see what number goes into 50, 10, and 26 evenly. Okay, so I'm going to divide out 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom because I have to keep it balanced. So when I divide by 2, 50 divided by 2 is negative 25. 10 divided by 2 is a positive 5i. And 26 divided by 2 is 13. Okay, now I look at it, there's nothing else that can go into all three numbers evenly. So this would be my answer. You may also see it as negative 25 over 13 plus 5 over 13i. Okay, this is another way that you could see it. They are both correct. Moving on to example 3. Now I have negative 7 plus I divided by negative 6 minus 8i. So to divide, I have to multiply by the conjugate of the denominator. So the conjugate of the denominator is negative 6 plus 8i. And I'm going to do that on top and bottom. So negative 6 plus 8i. This one's going to require a little more work. So I'm going to start with the numerator. So I'm going to draw my box to multiply. So I have a negative 7 plus I and a negative 6 plus 8i. So now I multiply everything out. So negative 7 times a negative 6 is a positive 42. A negative 7 times a positive 8i is a negative 56i. Didn't draw my box big enough. I times a negative 6 is a negative 6i. I times a positive 8i gives me a positive 8i squared. Remember, I squared equals negative 1, so I get 8 times negative 1, which gives me a negative 8. Then I start combining like terms. So what can I combine with 42? A negative 8. So 42 minus 8 gives me 34. And then I can combine my negative 6i and my negative 56i. Okay, that gives me a negative 62i. And now I multiply the bottom. So on the bottom, okay, I'm going to draw my box again. I have a negative 6 minus 8i. I have a negative 6 plus 8i. Negative 6 times negative 6 gives me 36. Negative 6 times a positive 8i gives me 48i. A negative 8, oh, it's negative, I'm sorry. Negative 8i times a negative 6 gives me a positive 48i. And then a negative 8i times a positive 8i gives me a negative, negative a 64i squared. Well, I squared equals negative 1, so I get negative 64 times a negative 1, which gives me a positive 64. So I need to be able to combine my like terms. Okay, so let's look. What is alike? We have 36 and 64. Okay, that gives me 100. So I have 100. Okay, and then my 48i and my negative 48i cancel out. So now I have my fraction 34 minus 62i divided by 100. Well, what number goes into all of them evenly? Let's look. Well, 34 is divisible by 2, 62 is divisible by 2, and 100 is divisible by 2. So I'm going to take my top and my bottom, and I'm going to divide everything by 2 to simplify it, because it has to be in simplest form. So 34 divided by 2 is 17. Negative 62i divided by 2 is a negative 31i. And 100 divided by 2 is 50. So now it is in simplest form, so that is my answer. You may also see it as 17 over 50 minus 31 over 50i. Okay, this is also the same thing. Okay, I will accept either way. Our last example, we have a negative 2 plus I divided by a negative 1 minus 8i. So again, we have to multiply the top and the bottom by the conjugate of the bottom. So I'm going to multiply by negative 1 plus 8i on the top and the bottom. So now I'm going to draw my box to show that I'm multiplying. Okay, so we have a negative 2 plus I, and we have a negative 1 plus 8i. And we multiply. Negative 2 times negative 1 gives me 2. Negative 2 times 8i gives me a negative 16i. I times a negative 1 gives me a negative I. I times 8i gives me an 8i squared. Remember, I squared equals negative 1, so I get 8 times negative 1. 8 times negative 1 gives me a negative 8. So this one, when we combine like terms and simplify, I can combine the 2 and the negative 8. Well, 2 minus 8 gives me a negative 6. And then I combine my i's. So I have a negative I and a negative 16i. This gives me a negative 17i. So this is going to be the numerator for my new fraction. So I get negative 6 minus 17i. Okay, now I still have to multiply the denominator. So there's my box. I have a negative 1 minus 8i. And then I have a negative 1 plus 8i. And I'm just going to multiply everything out. So a negative 1 times a negative 1 is a positive 1. Negative 1 times 8i is a negative 8i. Negative 8i times a negative 1 is a positive 8i. And negative 8i times a positive 8i is a negative 64i squared. Okay. Now I just combine my like terms. Oh, wait. I squared equals negative 1, so I get negative 64 times a negative 1, which gives me a positive 64. Now I can combine my like terms. So I'm going to combine the 1 and the 4, and I get 65. 65, and then my 8i's cancel out because they're opposites of each other. So my fraction is, the denominator is going to be 65. So negative 6 minus 17i divided by 65. And if we look at it, there's not a number that goes into all three of them evenly, so we can leave it like this. Again, you may also see it split up as 6 over 65 minus 17 over 65i. So those, either one, would be accepted. This is a video for multiplying and dividing complex numbers.